Zeus, the father of gods and men, awakes to find the Trojans in full retreat. Poseidon is leading the Achaean charge, and Hector lays sprawled upon the ground. Zeus immediately blames Hera, and Hera denies any involvement with Poseidon's actions. Zeus explains to Hera his plan in detail. Patroclus will fight, Hector will kill him, and Achilles will then kill Hector. The Achaeans will then push the assault until Troy falls. Sarpedon, Zeus's own son, will be sacrificed to bring about this fate. Zeus, via Hera, sends Iris to tell Poseidon to quit the war and slaughter and return to the sea. Poseidon eventually obeys. Zeus, via Hera, sends Apollo to rally the Trojans and gives Apollo his storm shield. Apollo heals Hector, and the two lead a Trojan assault against the Argives. The Achaeans panic and clambered back in a tangled mess. Meanwhile, Patroclus was still tending to the wounded when the new Trojan assault spurs him to return to Achilles. Giant Ajax forms a phalanx of a wall of bronze to stop Hector from burning the Achaean ships. The defense fails, yet Giant Ajax carries on, jumping from ship to ship with an enormous polished pike for fights at sea. Hector calls for fire to burn the ships, and the book ends with Ajax fighting off the hordes, having impaled 12 Trojans thus far. Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. My name is Deacon Harrison Garlick. You can find us on thegreatbookspodcast.com. You can check us out on YouTube and X as well. Be sure as we move through this year of Homer to check out our guide. So we have a 115 question answer guide, 65 pages to help you understand the Iliad. Also help maybe your small group to go through the Iliad as well. And today we are discussing book 15 of the Iliad. We're very happy today to have a guest with us. So we have Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson, is the Fletcher Jones Endowed Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine University. She co-hosts a podcast called The Scandal of Reading, Pursuing Holy Wisdom with Christ in Pop Culture. She is the author of many books, including most recently Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? A behind-the-scenes look at a work in progress. And also Reading for the Love of God, How to Read as a Spiritual Practice. And before Pepperdine, she was a scholar in residence at the University of Dallas. Welcome, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you so much for having me on.
No, we really appreciate it. So tell me a little bit about the Great Books program at Pepperdine, because that just strikes me as a wonderful, wonderful location to read the great books.
Yeah, I mean, being in Malibu does help. People always ask, like, how do you get your work done? Well, when your work is reading great books, there's actually not a better place to do it, because it means I get to take Homer to the beach and get to enjoy seeing the waves as I'm reading about the ships. And so I actually went here as an undergrad, and I did the Great Books program here over 20 years ago. And now coming back to teach in the same program that formed me is kind of a dream. So I understand the beauty of getting to read great books at this place, and I'm so grateful to be able to do it on this side. So
no, that's really beautiful for you to return, like as the student, to return as the teacher. That's phenomenal. I'm assuming you guys read the Iliad, right, as part of your great books course?
Yeah. So when I was here as a first year student, so every professor has to read Homer. And so you get to decide either Iliad or Odyssey. And when I was here, my professor did both, but he kind of did less. He didn't do Herodotus, and he didn't do Thucydides, and he did less of the Greek tragedies. So every professor can kind of make those decisions as they go through. But yeah, we read Homer, we read Virgil, we read Greek tragedies, and you get to kind of pick and choose within certain parameters of how you cover the ancients in a semester.
So as we sit here today, if you had to choose, are you an Iliad girl or are you an Odyssey girl?
I know. It's so funny. We just had our faculty meeting on this. Like, all right, what are you guys doing this fall? Who's doing Odyssey? Who's doing Iliad, and why? And kind of, going back and forth. I love that I get to teach back and forth. I mean, I really have taught both of these about a dozen times each. and I just regularly kind of exchange them out. So right now I'm going to teach Iliad in the fall because Emily Wilson has a new translation. I don't know Greek very well, so I always want to get a new translation. So it kind of helps me go and get to practice the Greek and get to hear different ways the translators deal with the language. So I'm actually going to do Iliad right now. It's kind of the top of my list. But if you would have asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I probably would have said Odyssey because I was doing that over and over again. So
Right. Yeah, I have a suspicion that everyone's favorite is what they read last. Right.
yes,
That's how it tends to work. Because
it's so true.
that's tend to be with me too. I read the Iliad, I'm like, man, this is really good. And then I read the Odyssey, I'm like, oh, I really like this too. And then I go back and read the Iliad with like a small group of guys.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, this is better. And then so it's just I've kind of been on a cycle myself.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your most recent book. So you have published a book called Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? A behind the scenes look at a work in progress. So tell us about this.
Yeah, this is Flannery O'Connor's unfinished third novel. So when she died in 1964, she was working on a third novel, but her first novel took 5 years. Her second novel took 7 years to write. And this one she'd written 2 or 3 years, maybe at the most. And so we just had a lot of pages, but she didn't leave us a lot of direction for like where she was going with the material or what she wanted with it. And yet there were so many good scenes and episodes, and I feel like it helps people understand that Flannery was in progress as a writer and that she wasn't kind of this finished, there weren't formulas that you could apply to Flannery's fiction, that she was always trying to evolve and develop just as we all are. And I think we get to see that in her work. I think it's important to kind of understand her more fully. So I went ahead and published her unfinished materials.
So how's that, like, just as like a expectation for the reader? Like, what's the format of that?
Yeah.
So it has like long sections of the narrative, and there's like a lot of notes that like contextualize it, or how's that work?
Yeah, I call it a literary excavation. So it has about 100 pages of her material that were unfinished. And instead of just reading a bunch of unfinished pages, which is not, most people don't know how to read that, I put it in a story form in which I'm kind of beginning the story with my experience of Flannery O'Connor and my finding of the manuscripts and how about this project, came to fruition. And then I go and explain where Flannery was in her life and in her reading and in her development, both with her ethics and her theology, and how those things played out in the creation of this art in progress. And then, of course, when we end, the story doesn't just end when she dies because it still is unfinished, but really the reader then becomes part of the story. How have readers then interpreted Flannery and the legacy that she has, and how can we add to what she left behind in a way that moves Flannery and her work forward and passes it on to the next generation? So I tried to make the story more about us as readers being part of the process of understanding Flannery. And so when readers open it up, they'll get to see, and it's clearly demarcated between what I've written and what Flannery's written. And I did that on purpose. So you never get confused. You never read a sentence and think, was that Flannery or was that Dr. Wilson?
Right.
I've tried to make it really clear. So
That's good. That sounds fascinating. Flannery O'Connor, I think in a lot of ways was central to my intellectual life getting off the ground, if that makes sense. I didn't grow up really in a house that, I read books as a kid, but they weren't like Boxcar Children. And then I found out Michael Crichton existed and read Jurassic Park and really liked that. And that was about the extent of my intellectual life for a long time. But I remember like in our junior year, we had an English professor and he assigned Flannery O'Connor. And I just remember being blown away. And like I can read this at my Christian school. Like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Like what's going on? And I think, and we've, here at the Chancery for the Diocese of Tulsa, we have a monthly staff meeting, but it has like formation. And actually for some of our formation, we'll read short stories together. And we've read, what do we read? We read Parker's Back is what we read as a staff, and like sat there and discussed it with Bishop. It was really fascinating to kind of dig into Flannery O'Connor, as this kind of like staff. And a lot of our people were unfamiliar and we're like, what is this? Like, what am I doing? Like, well, it's like violence can be sacramental. So it's, I'm very much in debt to her thinking.
Yeah. Well, I'm wearing my Flannery O'Connor like t-shirt right now.
Nice. Very nice.
I don't teach today, so this is I can just wear a Flannery around to represent.
Yeah. No, I like that. Yeah. Her works are just really fascinating. If this, we're on our year of Homer, and then we're going to do about 6 months on the Greek plays, and then we're going to do a year of Plato. So if this podcast is still going on when I'm about 68, then I think we might do it. We'll have you back on to discuss Flannery O'Connor on our current reading schedule. So there's pros and cons to moving this slowly through the great books, but it's good. It's very good. All right. Oh, one more thing. Your book on reading for the love of God, how to read as a spiritual practice. That really caught my attention. Can you just say a little bit about it?
Sure. Yeah, I wrote this book out of about 20 years of teaching experience, in which my degree is in theology and literature. It's a joint degree. And what I realized in studying theology is that different ways of reading the Bible can actually help us read literature in ways that point us more towards God. And then also, reading literature gave me certain tools and skills to help me read the Bible better than some of my fellow theologians. And I was going back and forth with it all the time. And then when I started teaching in the classroom, I would take the things I'd learned both from theology and literature and help students see, let's not read for a quiz. Let's not read to like get information. Let's read in such a way that, yes, we enjoy what's in front of us, but we're also moving towards interpreting it in our life in a virtuous way, in how we live out the things that are true and beautiful in this text that we're enjoying together. And so the book itself is just kind of giving people the how to of that, and then a few examples through history of like people who have done this, right? Ways of reading that really transformed human life and made people into disciples, right? In their reading practices actually helped them in that discipleship and in that sanctification process.
And that sounds phenomenal, because I think when I was trying to get like a group of men to gather together and read Homer, we had read a few of the dialogues, because I didn't want to start the great books just with Homer immediately. I wanted to start with something small they could get up and running, and they're like, "Oh, we like this. We could read the Republic next." And I was like, "No, let's like pause. Let's read Homer." And it was really kind of I had really had to sell them on it, right? Like, it's a really long book. Half the group had tried to read it and had really struggled at some point in their life. Now they love it, because it's, iron sharpens iron. Getting together in a group, right? I think it's been very advantageous for everyone. But one of the things I pitched to them was, this will make you a better reader of Scripture. Like, if you learn how to read Homer well, and you learn how to pay attention to all these details, and I read every night to my daughter, and it's like our bonding time. And we read the Gospel of John together not too long ago, and it was amazing how much reading the Iliad had affected the way I approach Scripture, because I was like, wait, why does he use that word? And why is that? And it really is like they play off each other really, really well. And so I'm really happy to hear you say that, because that's a lot of times like when Christians are like, well, why are you doing the great books? Like, why don't just read the Bible? Why don't you do this? It's like, well, obviously the Bible has a very particular place, right, given its role, and it's divinely inspired. But at the same time, like, one of the reasons of many to read something like the Iliad is it really will sharpen your reading of Scripture.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually have a whole chapter on like why read anything but the Bible. So the book is like structured on all the questions people ask in the church when it comes to reading and our reading lives, and then I try to answer them as best I can. But you were talking too about not getting to Flannery until later, but of course she is one of those who helps us read the Bible, and she also helps us read the Greek tradition. I don't know if you know this, but Flannery was living with Robert Fitzgerald, was just one of the great Greek translators. And so when he was translating Oedipus Rex, she was there writing Wise Blood, her first novel. She was living at their home. She was a boarder with them in Connecticut. And so the blinding that happens of a major character in Wise Blood is because they were reading Oedipus Rex together. They were reading his translation. And so there's all these different plays on a lot of the Greek myths that come out in Flannery. So maybe when you're like in your Greek reading list, you could like stop like modern. Well, we're going to have a break for a modern reader, and then we're going to go back to these things and just have occasional breaks. Kind of like Father Mike Schmitz does on his podcast, where he's like, Old Testament, let's take a break and do one gospel. And then let's move on again to the Old Testament.
Right. Yeah, no, that'd be good. No, I didn't know that at all. One of the authors that's really helped me to read Scripture well is Dante. Right. So Dante in his his letter to Lord, what is it, Congrande? Right. Yep. He's like, is that in your book as well?
Yeah, the 4 levels, 4 senses.
Yeah. So he writes to his author, and he's like, well, this is how, or he writes to his patron and says, this is how you read the Divine Comedy. You read it the same way that you read Scripture. And then he gives that little catechesis of what is that, the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical. I use that in OCIA when people are converting to Catholic faith. They have the class. It's like the best little summation of how to read scripture, but it also shows you
Yes.
why so many of these great texts have either been informed by scripture on what a great text should be like, right? They have all these
Yeah.
layers, or they helped inform the culture in which scripture came together in. And like the early church fathers said, hey, like in the West now, we just have like anticipation that like good literature should have multiple layers. And that didn't happen by accident.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, Dante's being schooled by both the Franciscans and Dominicans in Florence, and it's
Mhm.
under their tutelage that he learns how to read the Bible this way, and then it produces his art, right? So it's just a prime example again of how interpretation can lead to better and richer art that then also fosters better reading of the scripture, right? That reciprocal process.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I'm gonna have to pick up that book because that sounds
Yeah,
absolutely
thanks.
delightful. I appreciate
Oh,
you.
just send me your address. I'll send you a copy.
Good. I appreciate you summarizing that. So let's speaking of the Iliad.
hmm
So let's kind of look at a few things, a few high points that I think stand out in book 15. One of the things that we've been talking about on the podcast is the relationship between Zeus and fate. And so it's really interesting in this book, I'm looking at Fagel's, so around line 70 or so, this is where, Zeus wakes up, which is kind of a fascinating concept in itself about what happened in book 14, right? That he's conquered by love and sleep and what that means. But he wakes up and of course he blames Hera, which she kind of deserves to be blamed actually. And he kind of tries to squirm out of it. It's like, it's not my fault. But it was really interesting, I think, particularly the first time readers, that Zeus is then like, okay, well, let me tell you what I'm actually doing. Right, let me play my cards here a little bit, and that he's actually being, mostly honest. And so he tells us, right, that now what I'm going to do is Patroclus is going to come out, Patroclus is going to die, Hector will kill him, and then Achilles will kill Hector, and then the assault won't stop. Right, so he actually gives us the snapshot of what's going to go on, which I think is for first time readers can be somewhat jarring because it's like, wait, did he just tell us how the whole story ends, or
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
But what really caught my attention here is, we've been tracking this relationship between Zeus and fate. And, if you read Knox's introduction to Fagel's, he's very much like, they're interwoven and you can't quite figure them out. They seem distinct at times, but trying to parse them out. He has a great line where he talks about, fate is fixed, but it's also flexible, right? And trying to figure out how that works. And then you read the introduction to Latimer, and Latimer is adamant that there is no distinction between Zeus and fate, right? When he holds out the golden scales or he does these things, these are all like, it's like an alter ego, right? He's just almost play acting. Where do you fall on this? How do you see the relationship between Zeus and fate?
Yeah. Well, it is interesting because he doesn't tell you the whys of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? He doesn't tell you why these things. So if you imagine kind of the prophecies from Old Testament or New Testament in which God says, like, I'm going to do this so that you will know, right? Or I'm going to do this to show my covenant, or I'm going, or even Christ going to the cross, like, this has to happen because. And so there's lots of, even though all mysteries aren't revealed in scripture, when divine voice kind of reveals prophecies, there's a lot of like motivation. Like, you need to know the heart of God. You need to know who it is that you're trusting, even if he doesn't explain all the details. Well, here we have like the inverse. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Zeus gives us all the details of his plan, but we don't know why. Like, why do the Greeks have to feel like they're losing when ultimately they're going to win? Why does Hector get an Aristeia? Like, why is this necessary when Zeus knows that ultimately he's going to die? So kind of the whys of the plan almost become more difficult to understand the fate. Like, we do know that Troy's going to fall, and the listeners, of course, to Homer's story, they know Troy's going to fall. They actually already know all the things that Zeus says here.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, even if you think about it just in terms of mechanics, when you're telling a story, to lay out the plot, this is not unheard of. Like, this is, everyone in the audience would have known these things were about to happen. So the question becomes even more significant, I think, for like, why does Zeus then lay this out? And why must he ultimately be in charge of the plan? The very first stanza of the poem, right, when it talks about this is going to be about the wrath of Achilles, it's about the wrath of Achilles within Zeus's plan, right? Like, that's the opening lines of the poem. So there's always this idea that there's an actor behind the fate that makes it more personal. So even though it's still mysterious, it's still something that you can't reason through or understand completely, there is a personality behind it. And I think that's important for even just the Greek imagination to constantly have the personhood behind the fate, whether it's, equal with Zeus or not. The personhood is what matters.
And it's really interesting too to be just a few things that occurred to me. One is that we really have to track this as we read through the Iliad, because then at the beginning of the Odyssey, Zeus is going to open the Odyssey with another statement about fate, and it's hilarious. I mean, I think it's hilarious coming off the Iliad, right? So the beginning of the Odyssey is like, why do men blame us for all their problems? Like, we don't cause them. Like, why do they blame us? Like, that's their actions. And you're like, brother, we just listened to the Iliad. Like, I'm not sure anyone in the Iliad made a free choice. I'm working for the Iliad right now. It's like I'm not sure if anyone has a free choice in this entire thing. Like, maybe Achilles has, like, he can choose, right? But it doesn't seem like they really have like the capacity. And then you get to the Odyssey, and he just like drops this thing of just like, well, I don't understand why men blame us. And so it's really something I think to continue to unravel. And I think you're right. Homer gives us a lot, I think, to contemplate. The thing though that the other thing that occurs to me is what it's like to live with this understanding of the divine, where the divine can be like this capricious and this kind of withholding. Because I think that the role of Hector in book 15 is what really sticks out to me in this. And so maybe just like that, maybe anchor this in the text. So like he's on the ground, right? So if you remember from the last book, like I think Ajax hit him right in the chest with a boulder, and then at like 3:05, Apollo goes down and like resurrects Hector for like the 14th time, right? And like poor Hector, like he keeps trying to give his life for Troy, but he can't. He's not really allowed to do it, right? Like he can't do this. But so Hector's like being he's being thrown back into this almost like meat grinder. And the line that really stood out to me, where is this? I think it's line 570. Yeah, it's Hector. This is where Ajax, the whole back half of the book is like Ajax and Hector kind of going back and forth in their leadership and trying to rally the troops while they're burning the ships and things like that. They want to burn the ships. And Hector has this line around like 565 or so, where he's rallying his men. And he says, I see with my own eyes how Zeus has blocked their finest archers' arrows. Easy to see what help Zeus lends to mortals, either those that he gives to passing glory. I mean, the irony of that is just thick, right? Because I mean, you're sitting here and he's saying this while you're also realizing that he's being used. Like his doom is fixed, Troy's doom is fixed. And he's basically being used and given a momentary moment of glory for the sake of actually building up another character's glory, right? Achilles. You really feel for him in this text.
Yeah, with my own eyes. Yeah, that definitely strikes me, because how is it that like some of them can only feel or perceive? Like you have earlier on, Teucer drops the bow and shudders and tells his brother, line 620, some god is ravaging our plans, right? Just like he doesn't see Zeus. He doesn't know who it is, but he's like, something's happening because I didn't drop my bow. And then right after that is the passage you read from Hector, where he's like, with my own eyes, I see Zeus at work. And it's like, how do you see Zeus? So how is it that some of them have the perception of the divine or not going on? What does that say to Homer's listeners? Are we supposed to be in touch with the divine? Are we supposed to be able to see it at work? Like, is there something about Hector that is more admirable than Teucer, who can't see? Is there something that we're supposed to learn from the story for how to see the divine at work and how to see it at play in our own actions? What are the limits? Like you said, where's the agency involved? Like, if the bow is thwarted from your hands, but then Ajax does get to actually almost kill Hector with a hurdle, like which one of these things are permissible and why? Like, at what points will the gods step in, right? What are their goals? What are their ambitions? And what are their limits as we're looking for their action in our lives?
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, because I think that what's so fascinating for the first time you read the Iliad, what struck me was that discerning the will of the gods is a very important step to being a good warrior, right? So they're like, they have all these moments in which it's like, nope, don't push the charge, or we need to retreat. And it really has nothing to do with actually what the men are doing. It's because they can see a god, or they see something happening that a god must have done. And I agree with you. There's like, there's like a hierarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why are some better than others? Because I think one of the things that, like, we talk about these perennial truths that are in the text, and obviously like the human capacity to discern the divine is a perennial question, right?
Mm-hmm.
How is it that we know the will of the divine? Here are the gods, and you have someone like Odysseus who immediately knows Athena, no matter what's going on, right? So if
Yeah.
she comes up and talks to him, I think it was book 2, right, where he's trying to like get everyone not to run away. It talks about that he knew her voice like immediately,
Mm.
right? There's a familiarity there. He's very familiar with her. Ajax never seems to see anybody. Um,
I know.
for,
I was thinking the same thing. I was like, and then there's Ajax.
like no one seems to Ajax never seems to see anybody. No one also seems to help Ajax. Like his like no god ever comes down and does anything for him. I have questions about that, but and then you get then you kind of get everything in between, right? You get people that can kind of see
Yeah.
what's going on and not seeing it. Even like who can see the gods as disguised as people.
Yeah.
Right? Some can
Yeah.
still.
Right. And then of course, Hector, when a god comes to help him, even in this book, says like, which god are you? But then when he sees Zeus, he can see Zeus for sure. So you're right, there's different familiarity with different gods because Hector doesn't recognize when Ares, was it Ares that comes to him
It's
on
in
behalf?
this section it's Apollo.
Okay, so Apollo, yeah. Apollo comes
Yeah.
to him and Hector can't recognize Apollo, but he does see Zeus even from a distance interfering.
Right.
So yeah, and Ajax, of course, is called the one who's like not the worst of Greek warriors, which is such a bad, like such a bad descriptor. He's not the worst. It's kind of like if you as a student ever received that, like you're not the worst in here.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a compliment. Yeah, I feel for Ajax every time I read those.
Yeah, because he does. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that, and maybe whether he's being compared to Hector. But to stick on this topic, I'm curious whether we believe that Hector understands that he and Troy are doomed. So it's interesting here because the whole back half is him trying to rally the troops, right? Like we can do
Mm,
this, etc. And he actually makes a statement about like, the gods have cursed them since they stepped on our beaches, right? They're going
mhm,
to be destroyed. But then when he went back and saw his family in Troy, like he seems very much in those conversations with his wife to be like, Troy's doomed. Like it's doomed.
mm,
I hope I die before you die, so I don't have to hear you being, crying and screaming as you're drug off into
mm,
slavery. And it's very, he seems to be all over the place. Because he talks to his wife, he's very dark. When he talks to his son, then it's super optimistic. I hope you're a better man than I
mhm,
am. Like when you live, like there's
mhm,
nothing about the fact that like you're going to get tossed off the wall. And then he goes
mm,
and talks to Paris, and he's like, "Hey, we can do this. Like, if the gods bless
mm.
us, we can do that." So I always like wonder, like, when he's out here rallying the troops, when he's been, I guess, for lack of a better word, resurrected multiple times.
Yeah.
Like, is he? Is he? Because he kind of strikes me as this tragic, tortured hero.
Mm,
Like, is how much of this is him just playing along? Like he's empty. He knows that it's not going to go anywhere. But the only thing he can do as a human is just play out this divine will and seek glory along the way? Or does he really
mhm.
think that he can like change something?
Yeah, man, there's multiple layers to that question. So on the practical level, if I have to think through that, you have all these other plays about Troy, right? You have all these other poems about Troy, and Homer's supposed to be the one who's gathering all those sources together. So I feel like some of the inconsistencies are Homer himself can't decide who gets it right in the retelling of the story, right? In some ways, he wants to leave multiple options available if he's going to combine all these pieces together as the great, this is going to be the great epic poem for all the little plays that are out there to come together into one great story, one great narrative for the people. So I feel like that's where you would get some of those inconsistencies happening. On a character level, I think about it in terms of time. So you have things like the French and British Hundred Years' War, right? So there's victories and there's defeat, and it's back and forth for so long, and people, you know, die before the end of the war, and their children grow up, and then they fight in that war, and it continues. I don't know that Hector knows how long this is going to happen. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, it may be that Troy is going to be defeated. Maybe he understands that. But is Troy going to fall in his lifetime? I mean, it's kind of like Lord of the Rings. Like, what do we do with the time that we have? This may be the end, but when is that end going to exactly come, right? Is my son going to live up and then fight in this war? And if Troy falls, is it going to be his son that suffers the loss of it? Or is it, and I just don't think he knows the exact time that those things are going to occur, right? They might have victory for another decade because they've had it so far for a decade. That's a long time.
Right.
To imagine that you've been winning this war, and they have been. Like, there's been a lot of, wow, they've kept the Greeks at bay for a decade of time.
No, I like that. I like that a lot. That's a good distinction, that he doesn't know the when. So even if he's absorbed that Troy will fall, and that he will die, that doesn't mean that Troy itself will fall. No, I like that a lot, because that actually plays into probably to some of the prophecies that we're going to see in the text with Aeneas, right? Being a leader of Troy, and how that means and how that actually works out with the narrative, because that in some ways is a win question as well. That's very good.
Yeah. Well, even with Achilles, you imagine, Achilles isn't in this scene, right? Achilles is on the margins during this section of the text. But Achilles doesn't want his fate. Like, there's some sense that Achilles thinks that if I stay out of this, what's been foretold won't happen, right? Like, I can forestall my death by just staying here on the beach and playing my lyre. Like, if I just chill for a little while, it just won't happen. I can actually avoid fate. It's kind of like Jonah. And, here's the prophecy, like, you need to go save the Assyrians. And he's like, I'm not going to go to Nineveh. If I just don't go to Nineveh, then I never have to tell them, and it's not going to happen. It'll be fine. So kind of moving out of the God's will, or even like you're reading all the different plays, like Greek tragedies are based on this concept that, like, if you try to avoid the God's will, you just play into their hands ultimately, right? It's a lesson that has to be learned.
That's a huge red flag in a Greek play when someone gets a prophecy and they're like, well, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to run away. And it's like, yeah, there's no way this is going to work. There's no way. Something awful is going to happen to you. Yeah.
So Hector is the opposite of that. Like, Hector's the opposite of the tragic hero in that sense, even though he ends tragically, because he refuses to run away from the God's plans, right? Zeus over and over again says, like, if you align your will with mine, if you align your will with mine. Well, what has Zeus promised him? If you align your will with mine, I'll give you an Aristeia. Like, I will give you your great grand moment in battle. And so Hector knows following through means that he's not going to die the death of a dog. He's going to die heroically, and he's going to get these great moments of victory.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because then we see, a theme pop up where it starts talking about his dark heart, right, and how much I think the war is actually really weighing on him. And you kind of think about that, because even in like the small group that I have, the men interpret how many times he would have died without the divine differently. And so, like, for instance, like some groups will see that as like, well, he's not a very good warrior, right? He's like, how many times he would have died without the gods' help? If he would have, if they would have helped him, he would have died early. But there's another layer there of like, yeah, but also think about how many times he's had to think he's dying bravely. Like how many times he's had to have the fortitude to put himself in harm's way, to keep doing that. And then he's denied the glory. He might have died in a glorious way, but he's denied that and said, no, you have to go back into the fight. That's what I talk about as a meat grinder, because I tend to be very sympathetic to Hector and really enjoy his character in the Iliad. And that's the way I read him, is that he's just thrown into a situation in which he's almost just being eroded. And the tragic part is like, yeah, he's going to get this Aristeia, he'll get his glory. But at the end, he knows like his city will fall, he will die, etc. And he's kind of just being used, I don't want to say as a pawn, but he's being used to force through something that ultimately is going to have a tragic ending for him.
Yeah, I would say tragic if we only consider death as the end. I think that's what the Iliad does better, and Odyssey does too, by going to the underworld. We have this sense that there's something beyond this. There's the Elysian fields. And so the whole point of the glory is this immortality that's available. I think if this book didn't have any sense of the immortal, you're right, it would be completely tragic. But the reason that Hector can keep going on is because he knows there is such a thing as immortality. I mean, that's what he's really fighting for. In that sense, he's more like a martyr than he is a tragic hero.
So you see the immortality, that's interesting. So you see the immortality, even in Hector's mind, being something in the afterlife? Because I think I would have, that's interesting, because I would have read it more as they're seeking that the immortality that they seek is actually because they don't really have a great understanding of the afterlife. They know something's there, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not entirely clear, right? It's the Hades. It's almost like the Sheol in the Old
Mm-hmm.
Testament, right? It's like I'm not really sure if this is great or not, right? It's just like I
Yeah.
know, but like the immortality of glory, right? That
Yeah.
like no one is going to forget your name. I mean, think about now, right? We're sitting here talking about
Yes.
Hector, right? And so there's an immortality to that side as well, right?
Well, and so that's where, yes, that I think is what he's not talking about like a beatific vision. Like his sense of
Mhm.
immortality doesn't have like dwelling with gods or being in paradise. It doesn't have that. It has more of the more people say my name, I like have substance. Like you can imagine like um a full body figure that will like fade into nothingness if you don't say its name often enough. But if
Hmm.
you say its name often enough, it has great life to it. And so I think that he realizes like he will have this afterlife because of all the things that God has promised him. So this over and over again, living and fighting and having glory is like keeping him solid through immortality, right? He's not going to dissipate into nothingness or the wind or the ether. You know, like he's just not going to disappear because of that. Whereas if you contrast him again with Achilles, and this contrast I think is just probably the heart of things for me when I read the Iliad. Achilles wants the here and now. Like he doesn't want the fame and glory. He doesn't put a lot of stock in it. Like it's he's like, yeah, I get immortality, but like I just want to this life, like empirically here now. And Hector doesn't do that. Like he has more things to fight for than Achilles does, right? When it comes to the here and now. Like he's a prince. He's in his home. He has his family. He could just be enjoying those things, but he knows that the immortal matters more than the mortal. And Achilles doesn't.
No, that's fascinating. I appreciate you kind of parsing that out. Is there any kind of like text or anything that we would look at that have like that idea that like the glory, the renown that you have in this life
Mm-hmm.
actually maybe helps you not fade away in the next? Like I'm thinking, obviously in the Odyssey it becomes because we have the whole venture of Odysseus going into the house of death. It very clearly
Mm-hmm.
your glory and how you died and etc. Because
Mm-hmm.
there's some characters there that die very poorly, and they're lamenting, right, their lack of
Mm-hmm.
glory. But there's any text we can point to that like that almost like if you become forgotten in this life, you almost fade away, or you use like this imagery that you just kind of like blow away.
Right. Dissipate. Yeah,
Yeah,
no, I'm probably reading it with Orthodox theology because I just got done teaching Dostoevsky. So
there you
that's
go.
very much an element of Orthodox theology, this idea that like the love is what keeps the immortal life. But that is probably more of a Christian reading of it. But I think you see even in their if you look at Aeneid where we know that their lives repeat, like the reincarnation that happens, um, the characters who don't feel drawn to that, who don't feel like they have to go through the forgetting gate, are those
Hmm.
who know that they're being remembered, right? So they don't want to forget everything that they lived before because they have this strength of memory. So that would be the only place where I feel like memory and forgetting is pictured in the afterlife that I can think of right now, that has
Yeah.
some strength to it.
Yeah, no, I like that. Oh, you see that even in the Odyssey, the characters that we'll see in the House of Death are very concerned about their families. All their priorities shift, which is going to be interesting
Mm-hmm.
when we get to that point. But they're very interested in like what their family members are doing, right? And do their
Mm-hmm.
family members
Mm-hmm.
remember us? And even like right now, I'm reading the Oresteia, which is a collection of the listeners don't understand that it's the collection of Greek plays by Aeschylus, and that one even makes it really clear that like there's almost intercessory prayer there, right? Where they're the
Mm-hmm.
living are
Like
praying for,
purgatory.
yeah, the living are praying for the dead, making
Mm-hmm.
sacrifices for them, but then the dead are actually interceding for the living. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a much more robust picture there, I think, of the afterlife, which I think we kind of get a little nascent foreshadowing of here in Homer.
I don't think there's a revelation for the Greeks along these lines, but I think
Hmm.
there is some sort of reasoning towards this idea, like this memory that would keep them immortal and why it matters. And I do think that Homer's uplifting Hector's perception of that more than he's uplifting Achilles' desire to stay in the here and now.
Hmm. Where do you think, kind of as we kind of come to the end of the text, around, let's see here, 770. I think our boy Nestor gives a little comment that I found interesting. Nestor's always giving interesting comments. Earlier, one thing we didn't talk about is um, we did talk about the idea of like being able to interpret the will of the divine and how important that is. But 15, by the way, gives us one of the first examples that I can remember of a sign from Zeus that both sides interpret positively. Right? So it's Nestor prays to Zeus. Zeus sends thunder to answer him, but the Trojans read it probably via, Hector's zeal through Zeus kind of confirming their assault. It was really fascinating because all of a sudden we're getting, these competing understandings of Zeus's omens. But in 770, the Achaeans are really being hard pressed, and Nestor, who maybe you have a great answer to this as an aside. I still can't figure out why Nestor doesn't fight. I understand that he's an old man, but then it makes these comments of like he can lift like things that no two normal people can lift. Right? It's like the goblet is like this giant. Right? So it's funny because like he's hanging out in the tents, and it just makes these comments that he's stronger than most of the army. But I guess maybe because of age, he's been exempted. But here at 770, he is appealing to them to fight, and he appeals to them on behalf of their parents. He says, right, remember your parents, your mother and father, even if they are dead. And one of the things that we've been tracking here too is piety, this understanding of like piety and gratitude, which I think is unfortunately very alien to us today. But this kind of like threefold piety, I think you see it in Hector going back to Troy, where he has piety towards the gods, he has piety towards the polis, right, and he has piety towards his parents, by extension his family. And Aquinas will talk about this too, right? This kind of threefold piety that kind of ingratiates a certain level of gratitude in you. It's very different. We don't think about this today, right? Today we have rights, right? We constantly talk about what we're owed, right? So we come into society and like, this is what society owes me. We don't think about the fact that like, I just leached off the common good for 20 years. I should probably start giving back. So like, do you have any insights into like the role of piety in Homer?
Yeah, I wonder if I could specify piety like specifically within this book and looking at what is pious on the battlefield here. So there seems to be a contrast with the metaphors that he's using. And I'm playing this idea out on you. I haven't played this out before. But when I was rereading this again, there's a sense of those who are predatory, right? That does not seem to be necessarily pious. So there's metaphors about like becoming bestial, acting like devouring lions, pouncing on people like dogs, eager for the kill, invading the herd of cattle. So there seems to be this sense of like when they're fighting like predators, there's less virtue associated with how they're acting. Whereas when Hector is compared, I gotta find it, to a stallion, and there's this long metaphor of like his nobility of fighting that seems to be more virtuous. If I can, do you remember the metaphor about?
I don't remember the stallion one, no.
Okay, for me it's 350, but I'm in Emily Wilson translation. I'll
Okay.
just read this. With this, Apollo breathed great strength and courage. So there's not necessarily piety to his family, but there's virtues here. Into the shepherd of the people, Hector. Just as a stallion who had been standing confined to munch his barley at the manger, breaks through his harness at top speed, gallops across the plain with clattering hooves, down to his usual spot beside the river to wash himself. He is all confidence and holds his head high. His mane is streaming across his back and shoulder. He is conscious of his own beauty, and his galloping legs carry him to the pastures of the mares. So Hector, once he heard the god's voice, sprinted, moving his legs and feet with ease and speed to tell the chariot drivers they must rally. So it's like, I don't know, it's really interesting. These long extended metaphors seem to kind of point us more towards certain virtues versus the bestiality of the hordes or the nameless Trojans descending like animals. There's this way of standing apart where you're being rallied by the gods, where you're acting more noble, where you get this picture of a steed with full confidence that he seems to kind of try to leave in the minds of his hearers.
I am 100% behind any theory that has esoteric readings of all the similes that Homer gives us. For this, because I think that I'm right here with you, because I think he plays with constantly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, one of the most obvious is at the beginning of the book. I'm not going to remember which one. It's probably book 2 or book 3 when the armies are getting together. He describes the Achaeans kind of in this bestial way, like these are the lions and these are the wolves and all these things. And he's like, and then here come the Trojans, and they're like sheep whose breasts are full of milk and they're in pain. And you're like, what is going on with this? But then you kind of pay attention. He's like, oh, he does use a lot of sheep metaphor for the Trojans, and they're going to
Mm-hmm.
get slaughtered. And so I do think he plays with these. So I'd like to look, yeah, because the similes, I think the animal metaphors and analogs there are important. Same thing with we see something very similar to this with Hector at the end of the book, where he takes on the aspect of Ares, right? So I think the same game is played too when it's like, oh, here's Helen and she's like Artemis, or here's Helen and she's like Aphrodite. Like these aren't just I don't read these as just like fillers, right? That he's really trying to teach us something. It occurs to me, even though it's in the Odyssey, there's a section where Penelope comes out and it says that she's like Artemis and Aphrodite. And you could not have two goddesses on the most opposite ends of the spectrum. Like, here's the hunting virgin goddess versus Aphrodite, the not so virgin goddess, and so like if you work through that one, like the best I could come up with is like, oh, well, that's when she comes into the hall, and everyone sees her, including like Odysseus and the suitors. And so it's like, how do they see her in that moment, if that makes sense? So no, I think Homer plays with these a lot.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, even looking through their comparison to the gods gives us an understanding of what virtue means. So in what ways do you take on the aspects of the gods, right? That's a participation in human excellence, because it's higher than human excellence, right? Like it's excelling. It really is excelling. It's not our bestial natures. It's like this participation in virtue, right? Can you be cunning like Zeus and make plans like he does, the way, and of course Odysseus does that? Or can you rally the courage of your people the way Apollo gives your ability to have rhetoric and rally the courage of those around you? So I do think that even in this one book, in book 15, we're getting to see ways in which Hector's Aristeia is being born forth by him imitating or participating in the virtues of the gods that's inspiring him.
So here's my pet theory on this topic. So when you're exploring the Iliad with your great book students, you can try and see if anyone can figure this out. So you have all of these things where like the similes mean something, the appeals to the gods mean something. My esoteric pattern I haven't been able to put together yet is that all the deaths mean something. When someone's like, all of a sudden they get like speared through the tongue, right? There's like these like really like very detailed like where they got, etc. And some of them are coming, right? So like Pandarus, like when he like he breaks the truce. There's no way you're not reading that and be like, this guy's gonna suffer a terrible death. Like there's no way he's just going to like die, right? There's no way it's going to happen. Like this guy is going to suffer greatly, and there's like another character early on where it's a Trojan that Athena favors. It's the Trojan that built the ships, and it has this like really tragic line in there where it's like, but all of the favor that Athena gave him like basically merited him nothing. And he dies, but if I recall correctly, he dies like being like speared through the back and through the bladder. And it gives this like horrific thing. So here's this guy who's loved by the gods who suffers this horrific death, and Athena just doesn't do anything for him. But then sometimes I can't put them together. I'm like, okay, so this guy got speared through the teeth. And I'm not getting my esoteric reasoning is not kicking in to understand. Or that one guy that got pulled out of the chariot like a fish hook. I can't remember who that was.
That's right.
I can't remember who it was, but anyway, I'm always trying to figure out like he's got to be doing something with these, but I might be reading.
You want more of a, I mean, I think you're wanting like the Dantean reading, right? You're wanting the analogy there, the allegorical.
Right.
And I don't know that Homer always has the allegorical sense. And I think I do the same thing. I try to read the allegory where he's less of an allegorical writer.
Right, and I'm very tempted to read that into him, but at least I have the self-discipline to be like, I'm not really sure this works. I can't come up with a great reason, but
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah.
Well, as we kind of look at book 15 as a whole, any kind of like final thoughts or any topics that you think we missed or anything you want to highlight?
Um, yeah, I really do. I love this book. I love the repetition. I think the repetition becomes important if you can pay attention to the repetition as you read through it. There's so much of like, you must have lost your mind. We must have lost our minds. Have you lost your mind? That happens all the time. And what that could be doing in the text, like why is this coming up in this way? What do they think is needed, right? When it comes to like losing your mind or having your mind. Um, is it just understanding Zeus? Is it obeying his will to go again? And that's what it seems to suggest is whenever they say like you've lost your mind, is because you're not listening to God, you're not obeying the gods,
Mm-hmm.
which again becomes kind of a modern lesson when I think of my children, like when they do things that they're not supposed to do. I always want to be like, have you lost your mind? And what I usually mean is like, you didn't do something I would have done. You didn't do what I thought you should do. And of course, here in the text, it means you didn't do what the gods willed, right? When you've lost your mind. And how do we see that?
No, I
So,
like that. I like that a lot. I did
yeah,
not pick up on that repetition. I'll have to go back and look at that. Well, good. Well, Dr. Wilson, we
yeah.
greatly appreciate you being with us today and helping us to navigate and go through book 15 of the
Mhm.
Iliad. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. This was fun.
So where can people find out more about you and your work?
Oh, Pepperdine is a great place for studying great books. So those who are really interested in great books should check out our website, look up great books, Pepperdine. Google is just awesome for that. I do teach here. I am a teacher, so if people want to email me questions or ask more questions, they can. But of course, I'm on Twitter. I'm on the regular social media channels too to find and talk to.
All right, wonderful. All right, everyone. Well, next week we will look at book 16 of the Iliad. Thank you.